Hello and welcome to the Channel Islands Maritime Museum Speaker Series for March 2021. My name is Audrey Howe and I am the Executive Director here at the museum. Thank you for joining us today. While the museum remains closed, we are ever hopeful that we will be reopening in the not too distant future. Thank you to all of you who have and continue to support the museum, especially through this last year. Once we reopen, we will have some exciting new exhibitions for you, and we will celebrate local high school art, experience some sailors' folk art, and we will be excitedly awaiting the tales of the whale whisperer. 2021 is our anniversary year here at the museum. We've been hosting some fun activities so far this year, and March brings with it a whale coloring contest. Please go to the museum website to download your whale coloring page and see the list of prizes that we are giving to the winners of 4 different categories. On September 8th, 1923, 7 ships of the U.S. Navy's Destroyer Squadron 11, led by Commodore Edward H. Watson on board the flagship USS Delphi, bore full speed into a treacherous section of California coastline, informally known as Honda Point. Traveling south in a single file, follow-the-leader formation, the ships were attempting a turn into the Santa Barbara Channel at night in heavy fog. They missed by several miles. One after another, in a span of just minutes, the destroyers jammed themselves to the rugged rocks that would be their fate. It was among the worst peacetime disasters in Navy history. The novel, Dead Reckoning, is a work of fiction inspired by these true and horrifying events. The book follows the lives and passions of a group of enlisted sailors on liberty in San Francisco as their paths cross with an anxious diplomat recently returned from Japan. We are very happy and proud to introduce authors Therese Vannier and Michael Corbin Ray, who will speak on the very detailed research into the disaster at Honda Point and the process of blending fiction and reality for their wonderful novel, Dead Reckoning.
Thank you, Audrey, for the introduction, and thank you to the Channel Islands Maritime Museum for hosting us. We've prepared some notes here. I'm not sure how well we'll stick with our notes. We might just end up tossing them and freelancing for a while. As she said, we're the authors of the book Dead Reckoning. It's a novel inspired by the true events of the disaster at Honda Point in 1923. I've already forgotten to start reading my notes.
So our new novel, Dead Reckoning, centers around the disaster at Honda Point, like Audrey suggested earlier. And we're mixing fact and fiction, and we just wanted to bring this story to life because we hardly know anyone who has ever heard of it, even people that are in the Navy. My brother was in the Navy, and he has never heard of the Honda Point disaster. And we just thought it'd be a really good story to bring to life and tell it in a manner where it kind of brings humanity into the story instead of just all factual.
First, we just want to give you an overview of the basic facts of the accident. This was September 8th, 1923. Captain Edward H. Watson of the USS Delphi was acting as Commodore of a squadron of 14 Navy destroyers. Watson was an ambitious man who had high hopes to make admiral. But there was a bit of a cloud over his career due to a recent accident involving one of his ships and another ship, which I believe was hosting the President of the United States at the time. So his career was a bit of trouble, and he was looking to make an impression and to regain his standing. So on this day, he was pushing for a record run down the coast from San Francisco to San Diego. But he was also distracted for a reason that we'll get into later. And he was relying heavily on his lieutenant commander, Donald T. Hunter, who was acting as captain of the Delphi that day and leading the other ships that were following. This is a map of Point Pedernales on the coast near Lompoc. It's actually on, today it's Vandenberg Air Force Base property. It's informally known as Honda Point.
But it's also known as Devil's Jaw.
Devil's Jaw, they call it. A lot of
for
shipwrecks. It's a very dangerous, it's just where the coast turns to come into the Santa Barbara Channel. For centuries, this has just eaten ships.
We actually had a chance to go out there to the Vannier Air Force Base property and see the area a couple years ago, and it just made such an impression. Just to see those rocks just, cutting up out of the ocean was really scary. I wouldn't want to navigate around that.
This was also a time of transition as far as the navigational methods, because there was the recently introduced was radio direction finding, which we try to understand, and it's complicated. Before that, Donald T. Hunter, he had been trained basically in dead reckoning navigation, where you find a landmark on the coast, you plot your course and your time, so you have an estimate of your distance, so you sort of guess where you are from that. He thinks it's more than a guess. But there were some problems that day due to currents and tides, which were possibly related to a recent earthquake in Japan, which was the great Kanto earthquake of 1923, which had happened just a week or two before this. And so they were still feeling the effects all up and down the coast. I think piers were washed away.
Yeah, a lot of records that we found indicated that there was a lot of seismic activity still happening, and it was creating, kind of wreaking havoc actually along the coast of the west coast of the United States.
Initially, they blamed these tides and this tsunami, not actually tsunami, but the earthquake, for the accident. But upon further investigation, that really wasn't the case. Anyway, Point Pedernales, you can see it just about Point Arguello there. That's where this whole thing took place.
And just real quick, for you guys that are in the Maritime Museum members and people that are just visiting, Audrey just introduced us to a new installation at the museum here, and it is all about navigation. And it's really cool.
Yeah.
They have you can actually use things and see, test your skills maybe.
So this shows the plotted course and the actual course. The black line here is the intended position. This is what Donald Hunter thought the ships were doing. But due to the current they were going against, the tides, part of the problem was at the speeds they were traveling, their propellers were coming out of the water, and they were computing distance at the time by propeller speed. Well, with the propellers coming out of the water, they're not making the distance they thought they were making. So they were much farther up the coast than they expected, and they had also drifted a lot closer to the coast. They hadn't been able to take a sighting of land since leaving San Francisco early that day because of heavy fog along the coast.
And we all know about the fog on the Central Coast.
Yeah.
You go through Morro Bay or Monterey, and it's just fogged in much of the year.
But Hunter did not trust the radio direction finding. He believed all day long they'd been sending inaccurate information. He trusted his dead reckoning over anything else. The other ships that were following, they were supposedly under orders not to be communicating via radio, not to be taking radio direction findings. They were supposed to be relying on the lead ship, which was kind of an iffy order. They were also supposed to be doing their own navigation, but they weren't being given the full information that they should have had. So there were problems all around.
Yeah, there was a lot of chatter from reports that we read, a lot of chatter on the ships back and forth saying, hey, can we stop? Can we slow down to take readings? And they were told over and over again that no, that can't happen, and they were actually kind of getting in a little bit of trouble for trying to pursue that.
The other thing that happened that day, earlier that day, the SS Cuba, which I believe was a mail ship traveling up the coast, I think, it crashed on San Miguel Island and sank. So there were boats in the water that needed rescue, people in lifeboats. And Hunter was concerned that if his were accurate, his position that he had been calculating was accurate, that they were going to hit the island if they tried to obey the radio direction findings. So he was trying to save his ships by relying on his own navigation, which is how it works.
The original navigator that actually came with the ship too, he actually did want to slow down for readings, and he was trying to get that authorization, of course, Captain Watson trusted his man that he appointed.
Yeah, the navigator on the ship, his name was Blodgett, but he had stepped down as navigator before this run at the request of Hunter. So Hunter was acting as captain and navigator as he led all of these ships down. And I will get into Blodgett at this point. But so this was the result. What we see here are 5 of the ships. Up the top, you can barely see the Fuller in the background, the Woodbury. They crashed on the same outcrop of rocks, which are now called Woodbury Rock due to this accident. The Young, in the middle there, on its side, was the first ship to hit, although I believe it was 3rd in the column, but it hit rocks offshore, and it immediately started to capsize. There was a gash open in the hull. 20 men were killed on this one. They were unable to get out from under the hold of the ship. The Delphi, which was the lead ship,
old newspaper clippings of this Honda Point disaster, and I couldn't tear myself away. I just kept reading and reading every single one, and the story was so compelling to me. And I went back home and I was talking with Michael. I was like, "You have to read this. Look at what happened. You're not going to believe this." And we ordered books on it, and it just kind of consumed me. And
she was haunted by it for a long time.
I was.
She kept pressuring. She said, let's write something, let's write something.
So I either wanted to write a screenplay or a book. And so anyhow, this is the book that we wrote about the Honda Point disaster.
It's interesting, Halama, that area, and Lompoc, we had a book signing when the book first came out up there, and person after person came up to tell us stories that their grandparents had told them of going down to the wreck site as children, and some exploring the wrecks, climbing on the boats. Just for years, the boats were basically a tourist attraction. Wrecked on the beach, what was left of them.
And it wasn't on Vandenberg Air Force Base property
there was no Vandenberg
either.
at the time.
They could just go down to the beach and roam along. And
yeah. So the Navy was quite embarrassed to have all these ships wrecked there. There were a lot of, there were several, I guess, salvage contracts that just were never completed. So eventually what we heard was the ships were basically just dynamited and dragged out to sea. Supposedly, the seafloor there is just littered with trash and debris, but a lot of it's just unrecognizable as ships or knowing what it is. These days it's just so hard to get there anyway just because of Vandenberg.
But it is an amazing stretch of coast. So if you go to Halama Beach, it's pretty much the closest you're going to get to the Honda Point area unless you receive permission from Vandenberg. But yeah, go to Halama Beach, see Don, get a burger, and read all these newspaper clippings inside and see all these old photographs that he has on display. It's tremendous. So these were a lot of the books that we used to help us with our research. And I know there are a lot of nonfiction accounts of what happened, but like I said earlier, we wanted to tell more of a human story. So they pay a lot of attention to the officers and the decisions they made and the engineering and the weather. And that's really important to our story, too. We definitely incorporate that. But what we were really interested in here were the enlisted sailors and the men whose stories were never really told and who suffered the most from decisions that were made just way above their pay grade.
Yeah, they're the guys that really got hurt in this. As far as the officers, there was there were trials afterwards. The only people whose careers actually suffered were Watson and Hunter. They were both, their careers continued, but they basically lost all chance of ever being promoted again. Watson had hoped to make admiral. He remained captain for the rest of his career. Hunter remained lieutenant commander for the rest of his career, but they both ended up retiring, I believe, around 1929.
Yeah, I don't think Hunter ever taught again after that either.
No, he had been he had taught navigation at Annapolis.
Go figure, right?
The old school navigation.
It helps to keep up with the times, I guess. So that's where we really got to. This is where we kind of really get to use our imaginations. So we tell a story that sticks to the facts as much as we know the facts, what they can be. But there are discrepancies and unknowns or suspicions, and there's still a lot of those, but there's room for us to fill in the cracks and with stories that bring the humanity kind of back into this, and that bring life to the people who didn't make it into the history books, the people who kind of drew the short straw, I guess. So that's kind of what our story focuses on.
So we get into a little bit of our research here. Ironically, though, having to do the fiction means we have to do even more research because we really wanted to get things right. And we had a few areas of focus that we had to concentrate on. And the first, of course, was the Navy at this time and these ships that they were on. This is a copy of a book we picked up, The Ship and Gun Drills of the U.S. Navy from 1922. Just a lot of information on training and how these sailors were trained. The blueprint here of the ship, that was something, we looked for that for the longest time as we were researching this book, because we really wanted to know the layout of the ship, and we never found it until after we had completely written the story. So we made a few adjustments after the fact, because we kind of guessed at some things, but there's some inaccuracies probably. One of the actually interesting resources we had, I'm just remembering this off the top of my head, the book written about the mutiny in World War II. It was a book of fiction.
Yes.
Does anybody know this one?
I don't know.
I can't remember the author's name.
The author's name either.
Anyway, the author had actually served on one of these ships during World War II, and this book was based on his, it was a fiction, but based on his time on one of these ships. And these ships were mostly built just after World War I. So by World War II, they were rust buckets. They were out as just submarine patrol boats, I think they were used by at that time, or minesweepers or something. But anyway, we looked at that book to try to find out what the layout of a ship was, but it was still hard to find. So after we finished everything, we found that, which was a little bit of help.
And these are Clemson class destroyers, and they're pretty easy to recognize once you get used to seeing all these destroyers. Now we know them, but you can tell by their flush decks and the four stacks.
They built like 150 some of these ships in the years right after World War I when they really didn't need them. So they had a huge surplus of these ships, and right away a lot of them just went into dry dock and just sat there being unused. So the funny thing about this wreck, they lose 7 ships, immediately they can replace them with 7 more that had never been used because they were just sitting there gathering cobwebs.
Yep. But you can't replace the sailors.
Yeah. So, but also about these ships, we would have loved to have seen an actual ship, but it's so long there weren't going to be anything left. We knew of one of the ships, which was actually part of the squadron that was lost today. One of the surviving ships was used as target practice in the South Bay of San Francisco just after World War II, and it was sunk there, and part of it is still sticking up out of the bay. You can kayak
around it.
Yeah. And it had been a floating restaurant before it was decommissioned as a restaurant and then sunk. But then another thing we found after we finished the book is that there actually is a ship that you can go and see. It's not in good condition. This is the USS Corbin, and it's a Clemson-class destroyer, and it's been abandoned in the Napa River for 30 or 40 years, just slowly decaying.
They actually performed battle drills on this ship.
Yeah, the Corbin was part of Destroyer Squadron 12. On the day of the accident. 12 and 11 had performed drills together just outside of San Francisco before the 2 squadrons split. And Squadron 11 stayed close to the coast. Squadron 12 went down the coast, or went farther out to sea, and they made it fine without incident. There was one other ship from Destroyer Squadron 12, which was the flagship, the Uss Mcdermott. And an interesting fact about the Mcdermott, a year after the disaster at Honda Point, the Mcdermott made a cameo in a Buster Keaton film.
You can't hear it.
I guess you guys aren't getting sound, but it's just music. They're basically trapped on this ship that they don't have any control over.
Only 4 people on the entire ship. There you go.
So that's the best
There
look we
it
found
is.
of a Clemson-class destroyer in action.
It is a really great movie if you guys get a chance to see
It is
it.
fun,
It's
yeah.
called The Navigator, Buster Keaton, 1924.
Yeah, 1924.
Yeah, and just, I mean, this, every time we start researching a story, it just kind of sends us down a rabbit hole.
a lot of rabbit holes.
Oh my
yeah.
God.
Yeah.
But yeah, this ship that they were on too has so much history behind it. This was actually filmed off of the Channel Islands, off of Catalina Island. And then after they were finished filming there, they actually moved to a swimming pool to do some underwater scenes with Buster Keaton. And the swimming pool was located in Riverside Municipal Pool. But the gear that they had broke the bottom of the pool. And so then they had to move the filming location to Lake Tahoe, I think it was. And then there they were able to film, but it took several weeks because the water was so cold. And I think Buster Keaton and the director had to keep warm by drinking scotch or whiskey, I don't know, something like that.
One of our many rabbit holes.
It's a rabbit hole.
We want to do a lot with just the culture and the lifestyle and everything at the time, beyond just the ships. And we ended up using another movie from the time, which was Harold Lloyd's
Safety Last.
Safety Last, if you're familiar with that one, with the guy hanging from the clock. That makes an appearance in our book in a couple places.
So that brings us up to another big area focus for us, which is everyday life, culture, and location. So our previous novel had a significant portion set in San Francisco as well in the mid-1800s, so this kind of felt like a continuation of that research. But I can just read a brief passage from our opening pages where in this story, in Dead Reckoning, Eugene Duman arrives in the city, having left Japan just days before the Great Kanto earthquake that destroyed Tokyo, and may have, like we said, later contributed to the navigation problems. So I'm just going to read a little bit here about Duman. And so at the end of an otherwise uneventful 14-day voyage on the morning of September 7th, 1923, the Cleveland motored into San Francisco Bay and unloaded at Angel Island for the dual filters of customs and immigration. Duman's status with the State Department expedited his clearance, but to no great advantage. Instead of waiting in line with the others, he waited outside at the dock by the empty ferry as one by one his fellow passengers rejoined them. For the most part, among the Americans at least, their mourning for Japan had given way to excitement at reaching their destination. They were eager to get on with it, and annoyed by the slow pace of processing the Japanese and Chinese arrivals, a good number of whom were pulled aside for further questioning and an extended stay in the island's detention center. At last, the ferry left the dock and headed across the bay, as many as could fit, Duman among them, clung to the rail at the wide bow to watch the city come into focus. Consolation of sorts could be found in the bustling wharf ahead and the busy profile of buildings carpeting the hillsides. Factories, banks, hotels, residences. Less than a score of years had passed since the earthquake and fire had leveled this great city as well. Tokyo, like San Francisco, would rise again. Fishing boats, freighters, and Navy warships studded the water and filled the docks ahead. Several dozen of the latter lay at rest, identical sleek gray knives lined side by side like a trick done with mirrors, their heavy gun turrets locked forward and aft in proud repose. The ferry passed almost in the shadow of one anchored destroyer before turning to the wharf, where workers called out as they guided crates from ships to dock and from dock to ship. Nets of tired fish rose slowly from their holds, draining water in scale-glittered rainbows. The ferry's crew tied up and the gates wheeled open. After a moment of hesitation, the passengers understood they were free to depart. Duman nearly lost his grip on his luggage amidst the bumping and pushing as everyone unloaded and dispersed in a rush. Soon it was hard to distinguish his fellow travelers from ordinary San Franciscans, except for the confused looks on those trying to orient themselves to the new city. He supposed he was one of those. He set down his bag and mentally noted the compass points, having studied a map before disembarking the liner. An electric streetcar with several jitney cabs were possibilities. Walking to his hotel would be a bit much. He was about to take another step forward when an excitement of Navy sailors surged past, immobilizing mere civilians with their loud momentum and enthusiasm for liberty. They were young and low-ranking and boisterous, and their quest for fun or trouble, or maybe both, had led them here. It was 10 o'clock in the morning and the height of prohibition, but Duman could smell the rum at 5 paces. So that's just a little bit of kind of what, kind of research that went into the study of San Francisco at the time. So
We don't have notes on this page because we just added it. If you can read that very well, this is a menu from the St. Francis Hotel from around that era. Menus were very different those days. You can see their frog's legs Jerusalem and their breast of guinea hen and squab and casserole, saddle of lamb. We go really deep with our research. Yeah, it's interesting. We actually have a couple areas where we actually are in the hotel, and Duman and Captain are dining and partaking of the bounty of the San Francisco cuisine. But I remember reading somewhere too, one of the menus had curlew on the menu, like the shorebird. It was like I can't imagine what joy that would bring to the palate, but apparently it was a thing. Down the rabbit hole. Okay, come back up. Now, the passage you just read featured Eugene Duman as he arrived in San Francisco. He's a fascinating character. He's a true character, not one of our fictional characters. Even though we wanted to focus on enlisted sailors, we couldn't really tell our story without him. One could even argue, based on rumors afterwards, that this disaster wouldn't have happened without him. At the time, he was serving as secretary at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, and he knew Watson from his work there when Watson had been stationed in that area. The two ran into each other by chance in San Francisco, and Watson invited Duman to travel as his guest on board the Delphi the next day when it sailed to San Diego. Afterward, there was talk that the two men spent much of the voyage just talking in Watson's quarters, and possibly even drinking during Prohibition on a Navy ship. They never confirmed that, but they never investigated it either. But either way, Watson was distracted by his friend's presence. After the accident, Duman left the scene to avoid embarrassing Watson. He took a train and just skedaddled. And he never spoke publicly about that day again until many years later when he was tracked down by the authors of one of the books we showed earlier. I believe it was Tragedy at Honda. Yeah. It's not really relevant to the story we told, but another rabbit hole. Eugene Duman, I lost my place here. At one point, he was involved in setting up an attempt to set up communication between the Japanese Prime Minister and the American President just before the start of World War II, in which Japan supposedly wanted to withdraw from China in order to avoid going into war with the United States. But the military didn't trust that Duman could do what he said he wanted to do, and they never allowed the meeting to happen, and then the war happened. Later, after the war, he helped to draft the Potsdam Proclamation, which drafted Japan's terms of surrender. Oh, and this one, I had to show this. Also another, not necessarily a rabbit hole. This is Mrs. Donald T. Hunter. This was a picture of her taken in the 19-teens at some point. I believe it was while he was teaching, her husband was teaching navigation at Annapolis.
Isn't she great?
I love that.
But since he got to show that one, I get to show this one. So This was supposedly taken somewhere in San Francisco, like in 1923. It actually looks like San Francisco, doesn't it? Even though our book is much about a bunch of sailors on a doomed boat, we do let them have some fun on Liberty, and there's also a bit of romance in our novel with the gal. And then there's comedy. We have some con artistry going on, and a little bit of drunkenness and betrayal. What every good story needs.
So yeah, we've got all that, but there's no secret where it ends up. So I want to read a section that might be considered a spoiler anywhere else, but you already know these ships are going to sink, or they're going to wreck. So to set this part up, the main protagonist we've created for this book, he's fictional. His name is Emmett Haynes. He's a young sailor, and at this point in the book, he's been locked up on board the Delphi for a crime that was only partly his fault. And what I'm going to read here, it's just a series of short, almost staccato passages, the way we wrote this. They keep shifting point of view, so I hope it reads as well out loud as it does on the page. On the page, it makes more sense because you can see where these breaks are. So this is a little longer than the one she read, so I hope you can be patient with me. Ruby came to Haynes in the darkness of his cell. "This is a fine mess," she said. "We play the hand we're dealt," he replied aloud to the silence. He shuffled the cards and dealt a hand to himself, eyes closed, doing it all by feel as he let his imagination take him away. They sat on the bed in her apartment, a mess of cards between them, picking them up together one at a time and returning them to an ordered pile. "That doesn't sound like the best way to win a game. Shouldn't you just deal yourself a winning hand?" "Sometimes you have to lose to win," he said. "That's the setup. You know how it works." He pictured Jack Pearson restless in his bunk just a few spaces away. "A girl's got to do what a girl's got to do," she had told him. "A grifter knows a grifter." Pearson took a wallet from his pocket and opened it to stare at a large stack of bills inside. "You hold back," Haynes said. "You let them think they've got the upper hand. You let them think they're conning you." In the captain's cabin, Duman took his glass and the captain's to the sink and emptied them both. He picked up the half-empty bottle and then, hesitating only a moment, poured the liquor down the drain as well. "But it doesn't always work, does it?" Ruby asked. "What do you do then? When you're outplayed or caught or outgunned, or your luck just plain turns bad?" In the engine room, the machinists made their rounds. There wasn't a lot to do after a dozen hours at a steady speed, just monitor the fluid levels and watch for warning signs and write notes in the logs. "Do you always have a backup plan? Do you always know the quickest way out of any room?" Blodgett stared nervously into the dark ahead as Hunter gave the order and the helmsman turned the wheel. "Do you get tired of living 3 steps ahead of everyone else? Is that how it's always going to be?" The Delphi turned eastward. One by one, the ships in a line behind it turned as well, any drift from falling out of formation entirely unnoticed in the thickening fog. "Yes," said Haynes. "No," said Haynes. "Maybe," said Haynes. And Ruby, "Come back to me, Emmett." "I will." The USS Young, third in line behind the flagship USS Delphi, but steering a parallel course offset some 20 yards to starboard, was the first to strike ground, its hull scraping alongside a reef, a gash ripping open at the waterline. With the ship traveling at 20 knots, the rocks acted as a ramp, launching the entire destroyer into the air, fuel oil gushing from its side as it slammed back down. The officers on the bridge of the Young, Captain Calhoun among them, were thrown from their feet. They struggled to stand as the ship continued ahead, momentum and engines versus solid reef. The shriek of tearing metal reverberated through the bulkheads. "Lieutenant, report," the captain said. But before anyone could reply, the ship began to list rapidly to starboard. "All hands on deck, sound the alarm." The Young's sirens blared. Captain Calhoun moved the engine order telegraph from full ahead to stop. In a span of only seconds from the Young's impact, the Delphi found its own reef just short of a looming cliff. The collision threw Lieutenant Blodgett forward into the bridge window. Hunter slammed hard into the helm, but kept his footing. Captain Watson rolled across the floor in a graceless, tumbling, drunken heap. Lattimore was the first to speak, responding to stunned silence. "Captain, Lieutenant." But no reply came. Blodgett held a hand to his forehead, pressing to stem the flow of blood into his eyes. Hunter stood in shock as the magnitude of his mistake sank in. Watson just lay there confused, wondering when he had fallen from his bed. Then they heard the immense twisting, scraping noise as the USS SP Lee hit ground off their port. In the engine room of the Delphi, the men picked themselves up from the floor, muttering confusion. "Silence," commanded Lieutenant Cruzen, the lead engineer. The crew ceased their talking as they stood, alert and fearful, listening to the roar of the engines and feeling the unusual shaking of the deck beneath their feet. The officer put his hand to the throttle and looked ahead to the engine order telegraph, where the command continued to read full speed ahead. The scene was much different in the identical engine room of the nearby listing USS Young. Alarm bells sounded throughout the ship as the room slowly tilted to starboard, the crew scrambling to stay standing on the shifting floor as water rushed in forcefully from the starboard passage. "Fuel tanks are ruptured," shouted the lead engineer on duty. "Shut down those boilers now or the ship burns." 100 yards west of the Seeking Young, the destroyer Woodbury continued unaware through the fog until it slammed into a small island of rocks jutting up from the sea. On the landward side, a bit behind the grounded Lee, the USS Nicholas beached full speed into the rocky shore. Blodgett stood, wiped his forehead with his hand, and looked at the smear of blood. "Alert the trailing ships," he told the radio operator Lattimore. "Slow and veer west, everybody." "Radio's out, Lieutenant. I think we've lost the tower." "Well, get it up," Blodgett commanded, filling the void left by his superior officers, "and sound the sirens to warn them off." Lattimore and fellow radioman Lieutenant Tipsard left the bridge on the double as Captain Watson rose at last and made his way to the engine order telegraph. He took hold of the lever and pulled the indicator from full ahead to full stern. "Sir?" Blodgett inquired. The EOT alarm sounded in the Delphi's engine room as the indicator switched to full stern. "Full stern," bellowed Lieutenant Cruzen, and the crew sprang into action. But with the change in the engines came an ominous creaking from the hull. The officer tried the ship's intercom. "Bridge, this is the engine." There came no reply as the ship's power flickered off and then back on. He tried the speaking tubes, getting only silence in return. "Bridge, are you hearing me?" "Sir," Blodgett repeated. Captain Watson stood in a daze, his hand still on the EOT. So Blodgett turned to Hunter. "Don, we don't know the hull's integrity." This shook the lieutenant commander from his stupor. Hunter gently pried Captain Watson's hand from the EOT. "There's still time," Watson said. "We can get her off this reef." But Hunter shook his head. "No, we can't." Watson did not object as Hunter moved the indicator to stop. The engine room greeted this next change in the EOT with relief. "Shut her down," Cruzen ordered. Again the men sprang into action. The officer moved the EOT response dial to stop, acknowledging compliance. The engine fell silent and the shaking ceased, but this ominous moaning and creaking of the hull continued. The men held their positions as if afraid the slightest movement might cause the ship to break apart. "I'm not liking this, Lieutenant," one man noted. "Neither am I, sailor, neither am I, but the captain knows what he's doing." The crew listened nervously to the sounds of their dying ship as they stood fast, awaiting further orders. The USS Young listed 45 degrees to starboard as the men scrambled through their slow-motion capsize. Sailors struggled for handholds in the quarters below and on the deck above. Topside teams attempted to release Carly rafts and lifeboats, but found it impossible with the tilt of the deck. "It's no use, sir," a young sailor said. "Those won't be coming with us." A lieutenant relayed the news to Captain Calhoun as he clung to the port rail to keep from sliding down the deck into the churning ocean below. "The lifeboats are no-go, Captain. We're listing too fast." "Then we stay with the ship," Captain Calhoun replied. "Everybody climbs to the port side and we follow the hull as she capsizes. Are we clear below?" "Not yet, sir. Nearly 20 from the engine crew yet to report." Below. Water and fuel oil rushed into the Young's engine room as the crew raced to climb the ladders. A sudden shift sent the ship and the room to the side and the men fell hard. Heads hit instrument panels, bones broke. The water followed the sailors, its cold weight knocking them back, pinning them to the bulkhead. It was already waist deep. Able men raised the injured and looked for an exit, continuing counting their last precious seconds, searching for their chance. The port hatch hung high out of reach above. The starboard was lost to black below. Some dove, pulling themselves forward hand over hand against the current, only to float up again, desperate for breath as they slipped across the rapidly rising surface like leaves riding a stream. Then the water began to rush in from overhead as well in an unswimmable fall of breath-crushing force, and then the lights went out. You know what? I was supposed to be playing a video the whole time I read that.
This is actually shot by the British Air Force,
okay.
wasn't it? Yeah, British Air
Yeah.
Force.
There was additional footage that we don't have shot by a German Zeppelin later from higher and slower moving above. But yeah, this was, I think that's what that was.
Quite the cock-up, huh?
Yeah. It loops a bit, I think we've seen it now. Oh, here.
Oh yeah, so there are so many ways to get off of one of these ships.
It
So
is after the wreck, we continue on because the people still have to get off. They have to escape.
So there were so many ways. This is what's called a breacher's buoy. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard or seen such a thing, but we thought it was just fascinating that they were able to rig this up to get to the island. They thought they were on the island.
Oh yeah, the initial wreck, they weren't sure where they had crashed. Some of the people thought they had still crashed onto
San Miguel
Island. They didn't realize they had turned into the coast. They thought they were on course. So yeah, trying to get to land from the ship, they used the breeches buoy. They used the Carly rafts, the Woodbury and the Fuller. The men there basically just abandoned ship and climbed onto these rocks, and they spent the night clinging to these rocks. They were eventually rescued by a passing fishing boat that just made runs.
He heard them singing, apparently.
In the fog,
In
yeah.
the fog, yeah, and was able to see them. But the men, this is interesting, they didn't realize they really thought that they had ran into San Miguel Island. It wasn't until they heard the train go by, they heard the train's horn, and then they knew that they weren't on an island.
This also one way to get off. This is Chief Boatswain's Mate Arthur Peterson. He was on board the Young, the ship that capsized, where 20 men died below. He ended up swimming from the Young through the dark waves to the Chauncey. He carried a line to the Chauncey, and so the Chauncey was able to send help back to get the men off of the hull of the Young, the men who were just clinging to the top of
And
that
weren't they
boat.
doing the hand over hand?
I think they were on boats
Okay.
for that pass.
Yeah.
At one point, this was in the evacuation from the Delphi. The breeches buoy at one point failed because the ship was rocking a lot, and the men had to be down below connecting the tautness of the rope. And I think the breeches buoy broke, and a couple men died trying to get off the Delphi in that way.
Including the captain's cook.
Yeah, the captain's cook was one of the men who died.
Yeah.
Yeah, more pictures of the wreck. Coffin, newspaper headlines. What else do we have in here? I guess that's all we have. That's.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys had any-
Did you want to read that passage with Peterson?
I
We
don't know.
don't have to read it.
Yeah,
It's okay.
I think they're probably.
Okay. Yeah.
We can read it if they want to.
Okay. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, I know there's a ton of stuff we just missed or forgot and might still know about if you asked a question. And it's okay if you don't. Yes?
Did you bring copies of your book?
We do. We have copies. We'll have to get it out of our car, but we have them out there. Yeah. Yeah.
And where else can people obtain copies of your book?
Local bookstores, they're booksellers. They can.
You can order from bookstores. It's available. They generally around here, they probably don't carry it, but you can order it. You can order it through our website, which is bobpress.com. If you wanted a signed copy, that would be the place to go. Just order directly from our website.
And yeah, Santa Barbara, I know all the bookstores in Santa Barbara are
Santa Barbara
carrying
bookstores
it.
are carrying it, yeah.
Halama Beach is carrying it as well.
Halama Beach, interesting, we gave them, they're the only people that are actually carrying paperbacks. Everywhere else is hardback.
Just for the beach. It's a beach
Yeah,
read.
it's a beach, yeah. People are going to get sand all over it, so.
Channel Islands Maritime Museum will also have copies.
Well, there you go. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So, yeah, we're just so thrilled that you invited us to
Yeah, thank
come
you. This has been
and
fun.
speak about this. Yeah, just so great. We appreciate it. So.
Yes.
So I think it's so interesting that you decided to create a character to sort of helm this book. Can you talk about some of the inspiration behind Emmett, like how you came up with him?
Yeah. We created him. Did he just sort of appear?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's how things happen with us. It's just like, oh, that sounds great.
A lot of it was just kind of trying to solve the problem of connecting Duman, who was a real character, with the people down below. And we wanted a story where, just because it's good storytelling practice, you want this guy to make some mistakes. And the way our story works out, Emmett actually does contribute to this wreck. He's kind of a con man at the beginning. He's running a 3-card Monte game, and he runs into Duman as Duman gets off the ship. And while he's doing this game, Emmett's friend, unbeknownst to Emmett, steals Duman's wallet. So that sends Duman, he has no cash, no identification, nothing to get to his hotel, and that's where he runs into Captain Watson, which he did actually run into Captain Watson at this hotel in real life. But we kind of jiggered it a little bit that way. So Duman, his wallet's been stolen, he knows sailors did it, he ends up blaming Haynes, Emmett Haynes. Yeah, so, and that is how the captain ends up getting alcohol on board, because he didn't have it on his own, because Emmett's friend had smuggled alcohol on board. So the captain, so Emmett bears responsibility in our telling of this story. So,
Yeah.
and one of, Emmett has 3 friends that he works in the boiler room with. One of these characters is semi-based on a real person.
And then the person, of course, that swam across was a real person.
He was a real person.
Emmett Haynes. Haynes is my father's mother's last name.
Oh, yeah.
Haynes.
Yeah.
So that a lot of, oh, and Ruby was my grandmother's name. So a lot of our characters. And she was feisty, like Ruby is too.
Yeah.
Ruby is very feisty. She is, definitely at that little light that Emmett needs when his ship is going down. So.
Would you recommend working with others when you're working on a book? Or, would you recommend the
Yes.
collaborative process?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, it's awful.
We go both ways, yeah.
No,
We have fights.
no, it's really fun because he misses things that I don't, and I miss things that we kind of like compliment each other a lot.
We do.
of
Yeah, we
times.
do a lot, yeah.
But then we also, oh man, like little things that you don't even think it's going to be a thing. Like the cover. Oh my gosh, like the first shot of the cover that he designed, I was like,
It was a rough
oh my
draft.
God, it was
she
so rough. It was
overreacted to
so
a
rough.
rough
I
draft.
overreacted. I did. I way overreacted. I was like, what? So we just kept coming up with things, and then we finally settled on something
Yeah.
that we both hate. I'm not
We
just kidding. We
basically
both
both-
love this one.
We basically both have veto power over what we're doing. If someone absolutely doesn't, but we still fight about it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We fight about it for a long time.
But then on the good side though is when you're coordinating with someone, you can actually like get different perspectives, and then it just makes the story so rich. A couple of people that we also know write all the time, and they write together. Terry Rossio, he wrote the Pirates of the Caribbean. He has a writing partner, Ted Elliott, and the two of them are just like, as you know, just a great team. So I know with books, it's not very common to have a writing partner.
Not as common with-
More with screenplays, but we were actually writing screenplays before we started writing novels. But we enjoy it and we hate it at the same time. Like any functioning relationship, right? Did you have a question? I thought you raised your hand.
Your finger went up a little bit
Yeah.
ago, but no, oh,
In the red jacket. Yeah.
you lost it already.
I
That's
thought
okay.
you-
I lose it all the time.
Have you guys written any other books? I mean, independently or?
Not independently. We co-authored another book called The Long Way, and that's set in China during the Opium Wars. And also, and then it comes to San Francisco. Like, again, we ended up writing in San Francisco. I mean, we don't mean to write San Francisco, but it just happened.
Our first book was actually, it was not a realistic book, it was more of a fantasy book.
It's historical fiction with the fantasy
Historical
element.
fantasy, yeah. But very reliant on history again.
We knew nothing about opium, and boy, we do now.
That was a while ago. We've forgotten everything we knew. Oh, well, if that's everything, well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
We really appreciate
Thank
this.
you.
This was fun.